Hi, and welcome to episode 82 of Only Human. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about one of my favorite subjects, and that is rogues. Last week, we had Sara Hammel on. I hope you caught that. It was a great podcast, lots of feedback. She asked me a question that kind of prompted this week's discussion. She said, Tony, do pilots think of themselves as minor gods? And I can't remember exactly how I responded to that. It was a slightly less intelligent and nuanced answer than I wanted to. I remember that much. But it got me to thinking about a few pilots that I have known that actually do think of themselves that way. And that's going to lead us into our discussion today about true rogue pilots. And really, more than just pilots, because what I discovered is that rogues cross all functional areas. So let's begin with how I got onto all of this in the first place. Back in 1994, I was at U.S. Army Command and General Staff College in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, I guess. Yeah. And a report came out about a B-52 accident that had occurred during an air show with a pilot that I had known many, many years before. And some of you are very familiar with the case study of Czar 52. That was a call sign. Happened on 24 June 1994 up at Fairchild Air Force Base in Spokane, Washington. It was all over TV, and for a year or two, it was a case study taught in a lot of places. I actually wrote up a case study called Darker Shades of Blue, A Failure of Leadership, that was translated in multiple languages and taught at command colleges around the world. But the story of the pilot, Bud Holland, is where I want to begin today. Back when Bud Holland and I were both co-pilots, I was a KC-135 pilot stationed in northern Michigan. He was a B-52 co-pilot, and he was stationed in the lower peninsula of Michigan. But we both served on this kind of committee, a numbered Air Force standardization and technical manuals team. And that was the only interface I had with Bud, but it didn't take much to realize this guy was going somewhere. He was really sharp, very charismatic. He was one of those guys that when there was a question about what was in the tech order, somebody would grab a book and start to look it up, but Bud would just say, it's in chapter 3, page 27. I mean, he knew his stuff cold. And so we went our separate ways. I ended up flying the B-1, and Bud stayed in the B-52. And I didn't hear anything about him until the names came out of who was on the aircraft of Czar 52. Now here's his story. Czar 52 was a B-52 stationed at Fairchild Air Force Base, and they were practicing for this summer air show. And Bud Holland was the demonstration pilot. We'll get back to that why in a couple of minutes. But on the final practice for the air show, he came in for an approach. There was another aircraft on the runway, so they told him to go around, make a circle, and come back and land for a full stop. And on that go around, he banked the aircraft up to 90 degrees, well beyond the limits of the B-52, which was 30 degrees. And the aircraft stalled, fell into the ground. One pilot tried to eject, but all 4 people on board were killed. The sequence of events leading up to that is what we really want to talk about today. During the investigation, it was discovered that Bud Holland, the guy I knew to be squared away, young first lieutenant, had a long history, at least 3 years long, of undisciplined flying, routinely breaking multiple rules on low altitude flight, over aggressive maneuvers, and not using checklists. 5 commanders, 5 of them, were eventually disciplined for allowing this to occur. So a little more specifics on the kind of stuff that Bud was doing. He had, and all of this was documented on video, right? So even back in 1994, everybody had video cameras. He had extremely low altitude passes. So by extremely low, one as low as 3 feet off the ground, where he had pre-coordinated with a photographer out on a bomb range to video and still photo him doing these incredible things. Right? He had a change of command ceremony flyover where he flew so low that it blew the hats off the people that were standing there in formation. Right? He had done the same thing over his daughter's baseball game, to where parents went scurrying back to their cars, ran away and called the base and said, "What just happened? Somebody almost killed my kid." There was a store owner downtown that said whenever Bud was in the traffic pattern, he would basically close the store for a short period of time because people would constantly come in screaming and talking about how dangerous this was. After each and every one of these complaints, and this spanned multiple commanders, there was no documentation of any of the things that he had done that obviously broke the rules. In testimony with these commanders, they all claimed to have given him a verbal reprimand. Okay? So, as we begin to look a little deeper at this concept of how people go from being really good, squared away people into being what the scientists call maladaptive sociopaths, let's look a little bit further at who Bud Holland was when this occurred. He was a lieutenant colonel in the United States Air Force. He was the chief of standardization. And in Air Force jargon, that means he gives check rides and decides who's qualified and who's not qualified for everybody in the wing. In fact, he was the senior instructor pilot in the entire wing at Fairchild. He was described by one person in the investigation as being cocky, overconfident, and verbally abusive to other crew members. Another described him as being just the opposite. Great guy, easy to get along with, and, quote, the best B-52 pilot that ever lived. So how do you square those two differences of opinions? And that's where we get into the really fascinating part of this story and where it led me. So being who I am, I decided to research this as deeply and thoroughly as I could. And I ended up initially writing a short case study, and then eventually that turned into a book, still available on Amazon.com, Darker Shades of Blue, The Rogue Pilot. And I guess, I'm trying to look here, I wrote 250 pages about rogues, but when I started researching the story of Bud Holland, what I found was multiple Bud Hollands out there in aviation. And I went back being a historian, and I found that there was a period of time when just about everybody was flying like crazy because there weren't any rules at the time. Go back to World War I era and the barnstormers and all of that. There was a time to push aviation forward when that sort of stuff may have been required to catch the attention of the public. But certainly everybody knows that time was long ago, right? Well, like in everything, apparently, there's a few people out there that didn't get the message. What I discovered was that even in the modern day, Bud Holland was not unique, right? He shared many personality and operational traits with at least a dozen other case studies I was able to put my hands on. So I ended up researching these and writing Darker Shades of Blue. And I'd like to share with you a few important personal recognition, leadership, followership concepts that I've discovered. And the first thing I want to tell you is that it's not limited to aviation. right? As I was looking at rogue personalities and rogue case studies, I found school superintendents. I found clergy in very high positions. I found lawyers, politicians, no surprise in either one of those. I found teachers and coaches, basically all walks of life. I found case studies that matched the list of characteristics that I had discovered in Bud Holland. Over time, I found a couple of other books. There's a great book out there called Snakes in Suits, and it's about CEOs and executives that are maladaptive sociopaths and share a lot of these characteristics. But here's what else I found. I found that in highly successful personnel from all walks of life, that they also shared many of these common personality characteristics and behavioral characteristics. So what's a mother to do, right? I mean, you point this all out and you've got these huge tragedies, people in jail, all sorts of other things going on. And then you look at the list and 80% of them still apply to high achievers. People that you'd want to identify early in their careers and help them climb the ladder to success. So that's when it got really interesting for me, because what we had to do was be able to shred these and understand where it begins to cross the line. And that's what I want to share with you here in the next few minutes. So, excuse me here. Hot as hell in Texas today, and a lot of pollen blowing around. So let's talk about identifying and dealing with rogues. And I'm going to begin with a quote from one of my favorite authors, Ernest Gahn, in a book called Fate is the Hunter. Still to this day, my absolute favorite aviation book. And here's the quote. Inside every man is a lesser man. Inside every man is a lesser man. And I took that to mean we all probably have some of these tendencies running around inside of us. And if we let them get out, it can get the better of us. So with that in mind, let's run down. There are actually 12 characteristics of a rogue operator that I was able to isolate out of this 2.5, almost 3 years of research. Number one, they're great communicators. They're socially adept. And because they're great communicators and they're socially adept, they are also manipulative. Okay? Socially adept, manipulative. That's characteristic number one. Bud, if you got in a discussion with Bud, you would end up agreeing with him 95% of the time. That became apparent during the interviews of the investigative team with the commanders that had been overseeing Bud's antics. He had great explanations. He would turn it around on him and say, don't accuse me of doing anything unsafe. It's you that's doing unsafe things, because I'm training these kids how to fly in a war. And all of these peacetime standards just aren't going to do that. So don't put this on me. This is really on the system that's preventing me from developing these young pilots that I'm in charge of standardization of. So you have to be really careful when you run into a rogue around this first characteristic, because if you sit down and talk to them, you're liable to become a groupie. Right? Okay, number two. True rogues are very self-important and narcissistic. Right? At the end of the day, it's about them and how others view them. They're trying to set themselves apart. Okay? The third characteristic is an interesting one. They're highly skilled and very often highly placed in an organization. When you think about it, they've got the social skills, they're manipulative, They're kind of out for themselves, right, with the narcissism. And so if they're pretty good at what they do, they're going to climb the ladder pretty quickly. Right? So far, those three things I don't really see as bad. In fact, those are three of the characteristics that you often see in successful leaders: socially adept, self-important, highly skilled, and highly placed. Number 4 is when we can begin to differentiate. They're liars. A true rogue is willing to bend the truth for personal ends. Bud, if something wasn't on tape and somebody said this happened, he'd say, no, it didn't. Who are you going to believe, them or me? And as the better communicator, more often than not, you ended up believing him. Right? So number 4, true rogues are liars, and they'll bend the truth for their own personal end. Number 5, again, not necessarily a bad thing. They're out to prove something. They're on a mission to prove something. Maybe that they're the greatest to ever do what they did. Maybe it's something different. But there's no doubt that these guys aren't passive. They're active, they're dynamic, and they're out on a mission. And that mission is to prove something. Okay. Number 6, a rogue will always have a personal agenda that outweighs any organizational agenda or priority that you have. Now, they'll being as smooth as they are, they'll try to weave it in somehow, right? You're the guy that's going to kill those kids when they go to war, not me. Right? But their personal agenda always takes priority. And that personal agenda could be a lot of different things, right? It could be money, it could be fame, it could be power, it could be so many different things. Number 7, really super interesting one if you really want to try to identify a rogue operator. A true rogue forces people to take sides. Okay? There was nobody during these investigations, and I followed up and talked to a lot of people, that didn't have an opinion on Bud Holland. And it was split pretty much down the middle. About 50% said, Bud wasn't the guy that was flying that airplane. You can't prove it. And I can tell you, having flown with him dozens of times, he was too skilled to allow that to happen to him. Okay? And then on the other side, people were saying, I knew this was going to happen. I thought it would happen a long time ago because he'd been doing it for a long time. Okay? Nobody in the middle, nobody that said, Bud, yeah, no, I never really thought much about him. He forced people to take sides. And that's interesting because when you do that, you create an us versus them kind of thing, which the whole world is about today, right? And then you take these groupies and you turn them into something powerful, right? And with you at the head of the pack. So that's number 7, force people to take sides. Number 8, they see themselves as above the law. Standards apply to lesser human beings. Laws apply to lesser human beings. They certainly don't apply to somebody as unique as me, who is so capable that I can see beyond the limitations of your rules, the technology, cultural norms, whatever it is. So they see themselves above the law. And that leads us to number 9. They have a lack of conscience, no remorse for their actions. And that's where the term sociopath comes in. Sociopath, and for the psychologists watching this, I'll probably get this wrong, but basically a sociopath doesn't care if they hurt you. Right? They only care about their own feelings. Right? So they can do the most god-awful things, and it doesn't bother them. Their conscience is clear. They sleep well at night. Right? Number 10. They're perceived differently by their peers and subordinates than they are by their superiors. I want to say that one again, because this is one of those really key differentiators between a high achiever and a rogue. They're perceived differently by people that work with them or for them than they are by people they work for. Right? Keep in mind, socially adept and manipulative. When you look down at Bud Holland, you saw this guy who was kicking butt, taking names, charismatic, highly skilled. He's the guy you want in a position as your director of standardization. But when you fly with him every day or work with him every day and you see this self-important, narcissistic liar out to prove something, whose personal agenda is over the organizational priorities, who are forcing people to take sides, you say, man, this is not a guy I want to be around, let alone fly with, right? So if you're a leader out there and somebody comes to you and tells you something that does not sound at all like the guy you know or the gal you know, that's a key indicator that something's wrong, right? That's a key indicator that you might be working with a true rogue. So number 11 is closely tied to number 5. Number 5 was they're out to prove something. Number 11 is that they're driven and motivated by some inside need to be somebody. Right? I think Bud wanted to be known, and some people already thought this way of him, as the greatest B-52 pilot that ever lived. Right? That he wanted that to be his legacy. Okay? And he simply couldn't do that inside the rules, or at least he didn't think he could. Maybe I'm wrong there. I'm putting my head inside the head of a guy I didn't know very well, but he clearly indicated through his actions and his behaviors this drive, this motivation that kept him doing these crazy things. And then finally, number 12, they have progressively worse and worse deviations from the norm. Right? It started small. Instead of a 300-foot flyover, it was a 150-foot flyover. Right? And when nothing bad happened, it got worse. And when nothing bad happened, it got worse. And then when he got called on the carpet for something, he talked his way out of it, and it got worse. And then he talked his way out of it again, and it got worse. And then he died and killed 3 other people with him. Right? So there's some lessons that come out of this. I'll run down them all real quick again. Socially adept and manipulative, self-important and narcissistic, highly skilled and often highly placed, liars willing to bend the truth for personal ends, out to prove something, personal agenda over organizational priorities. They force people to take sides, see themselves above the law. They have no conscience or remorse for their actions. They're perceived differently by leadership than they are with the rank and file. And they're driven and motivated by some internal drive to be somebody. And no matter what it is, if you don't stop them, it gets worse and worse and worse. And in all the case studies I looked at, and there were well over 20 across all these functional areas, law, politics, education, construction, clergy, all of those things, they all ended one of 3 ways: at a funeral, in a prison, or with a career-ending, embarrassing removal for cause. They all ended that way. So what can we learn about this as we kind of come down the home stretch here? First of all, let's look in the mirror and make sure that it's not us. Remember, inside every man is a lesser man. And over time, the lesser angels of our nature can overwhelm the better angels of our nature if we allow it. So step 1, look in the mirror. Step 2, if you find yourself around one of these people, get some distance, right? Don't hang with these guys. If you can avoid it, don't work with them. Help identify them. If you're a leader and you have to deal with one of these people, realize when you sit down with them, if you sit down with them, they are going to try to talk you out of, they're going to give you rationalizations and excuses and they're probably better at that than you are. They've made a lifestyle of manipulation, and they're going to try to box you in so that you don't take action against them. So know your options and realize that you may be boxing outside of your weight class if you think you're going to talk them off the ledge. Now, the good news is, if you can talk them off the ledge, if you can find some leverage point to bring them back inside the lines, it's kind of like a reformed smoker or drinker going back and talking to other people. I never thought I'd be able to get out of this either, but I did, and here's how. They can really be useful and helpful in telling their story and how they came back. Unfortunately, I didn't find any of those when I was out there looking, because those are stories that never made the headlines. So let's just run down a few of the takeaways. I gave you these 12 behaviors. Know what to look for. Know what really healthy professionalism looks like, and it doesn't look like these people. Oftentimes, some of the best and brightest will provide us some early warning signals that we can use to help them back on track. If you are going to sit down and talk to them about their behavior, get right to the point and prepare to be overwhelmed with their rhetoric, right? Their manipulative skills, their communication skills. I think it's important when we begin to see people go off track that we challenge every intentional deviation that we become aware of. Right? Because when we don't, we begin on that slippery slide. I guess, what do we call it? Normalization of deviance. But if you get on that with a rogue, it's a fast, long, hard drop. It's extremely hard to get off of, right? So I guess the final thing, maybe second to the last final thing, is we ought to all maintain a watchful posture for these people because they're still around. I do think that the book and some of the work that we've done in getting the word out there has really made it more difficult. I suspect we've driven them further underground, which is probably a good thing. And finally, know what to do next. Whenever you hear about this was a crazy event, so unlike the guy I know what to do next, because with a true rogue, there'll always be a next, right? There's always going to be a next progressive deviation, right up until the time, we're attending a funeral or we're watching them walk away in handcuffs, and that's too late for us to help them. So that's kind of it on rogues today. My sort of general flow of consciousness on this is it's so easy to let charisma cloak incompetence, especially with people we really like. It's also very easy to apply different standards to people that we think are experienced or skilled or that we like. It's also easy to know someone at one point in their lives, like I did with Bud Holland, and then find a completely different person at another stage in their life. Somewhere along the way, there were opportunities to help him make positive changes, but that didn't take for one reason or another. And probably last is the one that I take personally as a leader, if I might call myself that, small L. Never accept an excuse for noncompliance. I think what you need to have in order to accept an excuse or a rationale or a reason is the firm internal belief that they are committed to change their behavior. And you've got to, if you're going to forgive, right? Now, as a Christian, I'm all about forgiveness, right? I love the sinner, hate the sin. But with a rogue, they're pretty much tied together. It's really hard to separate them. Trust your intuition. If something seems off about somebody, it probably is. And, I read a great quote from one of my new LinkedIn contacts Seems like a brilliant lady named Shawnee Delaney, former CIA operative. And she says, if you get a gut feel that something is off, you aren't overreacting. You're probably underestimating. And I think that's probably a good wrap up for our discussion on rogues. So thanks again for joining us here on Only Human. I thought we'd take off on that discussion with Sara Hammel last week about some pilots feeling like they're minor gods, and wanted to amplify on that a little bit. And next week we'll come back with another interesting human performance topic. I'm not going to give it away just yet, but like always, grow where you are with the resources at hand. Stay vigilant because there's danger all around us. Keep getting better where you are, and I'll see you soon.